My sister got $100,000 from our parents for her dream house in Lake Oswego. I got a lecture about being more responsible with money and a suggestion to work harder. 5 years later, when both our parents passed away and left me the bulk of their estate, Victoria showed up at my door with a lawyer and a smile that could cut glass. She thought I owed her. She thought I'd cave. She didn't know I'd spent my entire life watching her take everything while I got nothing, and I was done being the afterthought. I'm Emma Foster. I'm 28 years old, and I teach second grade at a public school in Southeast Portland. I live in a small apartment that smells like rain and old carpet, and until 3 months ago I was trying to grieve my parents in peace. Then my sister decided that the inheritance our parents left me, the one thing they ever gave me that mattered, should actually belong to her. She had reasons, of course. She always has reasons. But this time, her reasons ran headlong into something she never expected, me finally learning to say no. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up as Victoria Foster's younger sister was like living in someone else's shadow, while being expected to be grateful for the shade. She was 4 years older, which in kid years might as well have been a lifetime. By the time I was aware enough to understand family dynamics, the pecking order was already carved in stone. Victoria was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong even when she was doing everything wrong. I was the backup plan, the one who existed to make her look better by comparison. My parents never said it out loud, but you don't need words when actions scream. Every birthday, every Christmas, every random Tuesday, the message was clear: Victoria mattered more. I remember being 9 years old and asking my mom why Victoria got to go to summer camp in Colorado while I was staying home. Mom looked at me with this practice patience, the kind you use when explaining something to a child you don't think will understand anyway, and said Victoria needed the experience for her college applications. I was 9. Victoria was 13. It didn't make sense then, and it makes even less sense now, but that was the pattern. Victoria needed, so Victoria received. I wanted, so I learned to stop asking. She got the car when she turned 16. A used but decent Toyota that Dad spent weeks fixing up. When I turned 16, I got a speech about public transportation building character. She got her college tuition paid in full, room and board included, spending money deposited monthly into her account. I got a partial scholarship to a state school and worked 20 hours a week at a coffee shop to cover what financial aid didn't. Every time I brought up the imbalance, I was told I was being jealous, that I needed to be happy for my sister, that comparisons were ugly. But here's the thing about being the less favored child. You either break under the weight of it, or you learn to build your own foundation. I chose the latter, mostly because I didn't have another choice. I worked through college, graduated with decent grades and a teaching certificate, and got a job at Meadowbrook Elementary teaching second grade. The pay was terrible, the hours were long, and I loved it. Those kids didn't care that I drove a beat-up Honda Civic, or that my apartment was in the part of town where you could hear your neighbors arguing through the walls. They cared that I showed up, that I listened, that I made learning feel like an adventure instead of a chore. I built a life. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Victoria, meanwhile, had failed upward her entire life. She dropped out of college after 2 years, claiming the environment was toxic and the professors had it out for her. She moved back home, where Mom and Dad welcomed her with open arms and zero expectations. She dabbled in online businesses that never materialized, worked part-time at a boutique owned by one of Mom's friends, and spent most of her energy curating an Instagram presence that made her look like she had her life together. Then she met Derek Mitchell at some networking event, which is what people call bar meetups when they want to sound professional. Derek was a real estate agent with a decent income and an ego the size of the Columbia River Gorge. He and Victoria were a perfect match. Two people who believed the world owed them something and were determined to collect. They got engaged after 6 months, married after a year, and immediately started talking about buying a house. Not just any house, a house in Lake Oswego, one of the wealthiest suburbs outside Portland, where the lawns are always green and the cars in the driveways cost more than I make in a year. The problem was that neither of them had saved anything resembling a down payment. That's where our parents came in. I was 23 when it happened, still struggling to pay off my student loans and living in a studio apartment that was technically a converted basement. I hadn't asked my parents for help because I'd learned that lesson young, but I assumed foolishly that if they had money to give, they might at least offer. Instead, I found out through a phone call from Victoria, who was practically giddy as she told me that Mom and Dad had given her and Derek $100,000 for their house. $100,000. I sat in my car in the Safeway parking lot where I'd stopped to grab groceries, phone pressed to my ear, trying to process what she just said. She wasn't calling to be sensitive or to acknowledge how this might feel. She was calling to brag, to share her good news, to tell me about the 4-bedroom, 3-bathroom house with the chef's kitchen and the backyard that overlooked a private pond. She talked for 20 minutes about crown molding and hardwood floors and how Derek had negotiated such a great deal. I said congratulations because what else do you say? Then I sat in that parking lot for another hour, staring at my grocery list, wondering why I'd ever believed things might be different. I called my parents that night. I didn't want to start a fight, but I needed to understand. Dad answered, his voice warm and familiar, and I asked him outright, why give Victoria $100,000 and not offer me anything? There was a pause, the kind that stretches long enough to fill with all the unspoken things a family never says. Then he sighed, and I could picture him rubbing the bridge of his nose the way he did when he was uncomfortable. He said Victoria needed the help more than I did. He said I was doing fine on my own, that I was responsible and capable, and that they knew I'd figure things out. He said the money was an early inheritance, that it would all balance out eventually. I wanted to scream. Wanted to ask how it was fair to give one child everything and tell the other child that being self-sufficient was its own reward. Instead I said okay, told him I loved him and hung up. I cried for an hour, then I wiped my face, made a box of mac and cheese for dinner, and decided I was done expecting anything from them. That's when Uncle James came into the picture, really came into it, not just as the uncle who showed up for holidays but as someone who saw what was happening and refused to pretend it was normal. Uncle James was my dad's older brother. A guy who'd spent 30 years as a firefighter before retiring early to run a small woodworking shop out of his garage in Beaverton. He was the kind of man who didn't say much, but when he did, it mattered. He'd always been kind to me, but after the house situation, he started checking in more. He'd invite me over for dinner, let me help him sand down table legs or stain bookshelves, and we'd talk. Not about Victoria directly, not at first, but about life, about fairness, about how sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones who hurt you the most without meaning to. One evening, as we sat in his workshop with the smell of sawdust and varnish thick in the air, he told me something I've never forgotten. He said my dad had always been blind when it came to Victoria, that even as kids, Robert had a soft spot for people who seemed like they needed saving. He said my dad wasn't a bad man, just a weak one when it came to setting boundaries with his daughters. Then he looked me dead in the eye and said I deserved better, that I should never apologize for expecting to be treated with the same care and consideration as my sister. It was the first time anyone in my family had acknowledged the imbalance out loud, and something in me cracked open. Not in a breaking way, but in a way that let light in. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't selfish. I was just a person who wanted to matter. Victoria, meanwhile, settled into her Lake Oswego life like she'd been born for it. She posted endless photos of her perfect house, her perfect husband, her perfect brunch dates with women who all looked like they shopped at the same 3 stores. She joined a book club she never read for, a yoga studio she attended twice, and a wine tasting group that seemed to meet every other day. She didn't work, not really. Derek's income and whatever residual help my parents provided kept them afloat, though Victoria always made it sound like they were struggling, like they were just barely scraping by in their $500,000 home. I saw her maybe twice a year, always at family gatherings, and every time she'd ask how I was doing with this tone that suggested she already knew the answer and felt sorry for me. I'd smile, say I was great, and change the subject. There was no point in engaging. She lived in her world, I lived in mine, and I'd made peace with the fact that those worlds would never overlap in any meaningful way. Then, 3 years after the house gift, I hit a rough patch. My student loans were crushing me, my car needed repairs I couldn't afford, and my landlord raised my rent by $200. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. A month. I was working summer school just to keep up and I was exhausted. I thought, maybe naively, that this might be a time when my parents would offer help. Not $100,000, just something. Anything. I called my mom and explained the situation, trying to keep my voice steady, trying not to sound desperate. She listened, made sympathetic noises, and then said they just helped Victoria and Derek with some unexpected expenses and didn't have extra to spare right now. She suggested I look into a side job or maybe cut back on non-essentials. I thanked her, hung up, and stared at the wall of my tiny apartment. Non-essentials. I was already buying store-brand everything and hadn't eaten out in months. I picked up a weekend tutoring gig and made it work because that's what I always did. I made it work. Uncle James, on the other hand, showed up at my apartment 2 weeks later with a check for $3,000. He said it was a loan, no interest, pay him back whenever I could. I tried to refuse, but he wouldn't hear it. He said family was supposed to help each other, and if my parents couldn't see that, then he'd do it himself. I cried, which I hated doing in front of people, but he just hugged me and told me I was going to be fine. I paid him back over the next year, a little bit each month, and he never once made me feel like I owed him anything beyond that. He was the kind of family I wished I'd been born into. Then everything changed. My dad got sick. It started with a cough he couldn't shake, the kind that lingers after a cold and makes you sound like you've been smoking for 40 years. He ignored it for weeks because that's what Robert Foster did, ignored things until they became undeniable. By the time Mom convinced him to see a doctor, the cough had turned into chest pain and shortness of breath. The diagnosis came fast and hit hard, stage 3 lung cancer. He'd never smoked a day in his life, but sometimes the universe doesn't care about fairness. The doctors said treatment could buy him time, maybe a year, maybe 2 if they were lucky. My mom called to tell me, her voice shaking, and I drove to Salem that same night. I walked into my childhood home and saw my dad sitting in his recliner, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him, and something inside me shifted. All the hurt, all the resentment, it didn't disappear, but it took a back seat to the fact that my father was dying. I moved back home temporarily, taking a leave of absence from teaching that stretched longer than I'd planned. Someone needed to take Dad to his appointments, to sit with him during chemo sessions that left him weak and nauseous, to help Mom navigate the maze of insurance claims and medical bills. Victoria came to visit exactly 3 times in the first 2 months. Each visit lasted less than an hour. She'd sweep in with her designer purse and her carefully applied makeup, hug Dad gently like he might break, ask how he was feeling in that high-pitched voice people use when they're performing concern rather than feeling it, and then find a reason to leave. Derek was busy with work. They had a dinner reservation they'd made weeks ago. She wasn't feeling well herself and didn't want to risk getting Dad sick, even though he was already sick with something that had nothing to do with contagion. The excuses piled up like dirty dishes, and I stopped expecting anything different. What struck me most during those months wasn't just Victoria's absence, though that was glaring enough. It was the way my parents didn't seem surprised by it. Mom would mention, almost apologetically, that Victoria had a lot on her plate, that the drive from Lake Oswego was hard for her, that we shouldn't expect too much. I wanted to ask what exactly was on Victoria's plate besides brunch dates and Instagram stories, but I bit my tongue. Dad never said anything. At all. He'd ask about her in this hopeful way, like maybe this time she'd stay longer, maybe this time she'd actually be present, and when she inevitably left early, he'd just nod and turn back to whatever game show was playing on the television. It was like watching someone wait for a bus that everyone else knew wasn't coming. Uncle James, predictably, was there. He showed up twice a week without fail, bringing groceries, helping with yard work, sitting with Dad so Mom and I could take a break. He'd tell stories about their childhood, about the trouble they got into as boys, about the time they tried to build a treehouse and nearly broke both their legs falling out of the oak tree in their parents' backyard. Dad would laugh, really laugh, in a way that made him sound like himself again. And those moments were worth more than any amount of money Victoria's house had cost. The cancer treatment bought Dad 8 months. 8 months of hope and denial and bargaining with a universe that doesn't take bargains. He responded well to the chemo at first, well enough that we started talking about the future again, about things he wanted to do when he felt better. Then the cancer came back aggressive and fast, and the doctors ran out of options. They said hospice, palliative care, making him comfortable. We moved a hospital bed into the living room because he didn't want to be upstairs, cut off from the life of the house. I slept on the couch most nights, listening to him breathe, terrified every time there was a pause between breaths that it might be the last one. Mom was barely holding it together. She'd always been the kind of woman who prided herself on keeping up appearances, on making sure everything looked nice even when it wasn't, and watching her husband die was destroying that facade. She stopped doing her hair, stopped wearing anything but sweatpants and old t-shirts, stopped answering the phone when friends called to check in. I tried to help, tried to take care of her while also taking care of Dad, but grief is a selfish thing. Takes everything you have and then asks for more. Victoria showed up the week before Dad died. She didn't call ahead, just appeared at the door one afternoon with tears already streaming down her face, though I couldn't tell if they were real or part of the performance. She went straight to Dad's bedside, held his hand, told him she loved him over and over like repetition could make up for months of absence. He smiled at her, squeezed her hand back, told her he loved her too. I stood in the doorway watching this reunion, feeling something cold and hard settle in my chest. Part of me wanted to scream at her, to ask where she'd been when he needed her, when we all needed her. Part of me just wanted her to leave so we could go back to the quiet, painful rhythm we'd established. She stayed for 2 hours that day, then left because she had a headache and the smell of the house was making her nauseous. The smell was medication and sickness and dying, but she said it like it was something we could control, like we'd chosen this. Dad passed 3 days later, early on a Thursday morning when the house was still dark and quiet. I was holding one of his hands, Mom was holding the other, and Uncle James was sitting in the corner of the room, silent and solid. Dad's breathing had been labored for hours, each inhale a struggle, each exhale sounding like relief. Then there was an inhale that didn't lead to an exhale, and the room became impossibly still. Mom let out a sound I'd never heard before, something between a sob and a wail, and Uncle James stood up, walked over, and placed his hand on Dad's shoulder like he was saying goodbye to an old friend. I just sat there, numb, staring at my father's face, trying to memorize it before it became something else, something not him. I called Victoria. It rang 6 times before she answered, her voice groggy and annoyed. I told her Dad was gone. There was a pause, then crying loud and dramatic, and she said she'd come right over. She arrived 4 hours later. The funeral was a blur of casseroles and condolences and people telling me how strong I was, which is what people say when they don't know what else to say. Victoria played the grieving daughter beautifully, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, accepting hugs from relatives who didn't know any better, talking about how close she and Dad had been. I watched her perform and felt nothing. Uncle James stood next to me during the service, a quiet anchor in a sea of performative grief, and when Victoria started talking about how hard it was to lose a parent, how she wished she'd had more time with him, he leaned over and whispered, "She's unbelievable." I almost laughed, which would have been inappropriate, but the absurdity of it all was crushing. My father was dead, my mother was falling apart, and Victoria was worried about how she looked in her mourning outfit. What I didn't expect was for Mom to follow so quickly. She'd been declining throughout Dad's illness, but we'd all assumed it was the stress, the exhaustion, the emotional toll of watching your partner die slowly. 2 weeks after the funeral, she had a stroke. A major one. I found her on the kitchen floor in the middle of the afternoon, her face drooping on one side, her speech slurred and incoherent. The ambulance came fast, but the damage was already done. The doctors said the stroke had affected a significant portion of her brain, that recovery was unlikely, that we should prepare for the worst. She lived for 6 more weeks in a hospital bed, mostly unconscious, occasionally opening her eyes but not really seeing anything. Victoria visited twice during those 6 weeks. Twice. Each time she'd stay just long enough to cry at Mom's bedside, to hold her unresponsive hand, to tell me how hard this was for her. I stopped responding. What was the point? Mom passed away on a Sunday afternoon with me sitting next to her and Uncle James standing by the window. Victoria didn't make it in time, said there was traffic on I-5. Said she tried to get there faster but couldn't. I didn't have the energy to argue. Burying both parents within 2 months of each other is a special kind of hell. The grief doesn't have time to settle before it's compounded, and you find yourself moving through the world like you're underwater, everything muffled and slow and exhausting. I went back to teaching because I didn't know what else to do, and those second graders with their missing teeth and endless questions were the only thing that felt real. Uncle James checked on me constantly, brought me meals I forgot to eat, sat with me in silence when I didn't want to talk. Victoria sent a few texts asking how I was doing, each one shorter than the last, and then the communication stopped. I assumed she'd moved on, gone back to her Lake Oswego life and her Instagram feed and her wine club. I was wrong. 3 weeks after Mom's funeral, I got a call from a lawyer's office. Mr. Gerald Hampton, attorney for the Foster estate, wanted to schedule a meeting to discuss my parents' will. I'd known this was coming, had signed papers at the hospital and the funeral home, but the reality of it still felt surreal. My parents were gone, and now we had to divide up what was left of them into legal documents and property transfers. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon at Hampton's office in downtown Portland, a sleek high-rise with floor-to-ceiling windows and furniture that looked too expensive to sit on. I took the afternoon off work, put on the one professional outfit I owned that wasn't covered in chalk dust, and drove into the city. Uncle James met me in the lobby, wearing a button-up shirt and slacks, looking uncomfortable but determined. Victoria arrived 20 minutes late, her heels clicking on the marble floor, Derek trailing behind her like an accessory. She hugged me, a brief perfunctory thing, and said something about traffic that I didn't bother listening to. Mr. Hampton's office was all dark wood and leather chairs, the kind of place designed to make you feel like serious business was being conducted. He was an older man, late 50s maybe, with silver hair and reading glasses perched on his nose. He greeted us professionally, offered condolences that sounded genuine, and gestured for us to sit. Victoria and Derek took the chairs closest to the desk. Uncle James and I sat slightly behind them, and I noticed the seating arrangement immediately, the way Victoria positioned herself as the primary heir without even being told she was. Mr. Hampton opened a folder, pulled out several documents, and began speaking in that careful lawyer voice that turns human emotion into legal terminology. He explained that our parents had updated their will 2 years ago, that everything had been carefully documented and notarized, that there were specific instructions that needed to be followed. Victoria was leaning forward, hands clasped in her lap, looking appropriately somber but also eager, like a kid waiting to open presents on Christmas morning. Mr. Hampton cleared his throat and began reading. The estate consisted of the house in Salem, valued at approximately $450,000, a savings account with just over $100,000, an investment portfolio worth another $100,000, Dad's vintage truck collection, 3 vehicles in various states of restoration, valued collectively at around $80,000. Total estate value, roughly $730,000. Victoria's eyes lit up, and I saw her doing the math in her head, dividing that number by 2, already planning what she'd do with her share. Then Mr. Hampton continued reading, and the air in the room changed. The will stated that because Victoria Foster had received a substantial monetary gift of $100,000 from Robert and Patricia Foster 5 years prior, and because that gift had been explicitly labeled as an early inheritance at the time it was given, the current estate would be divided to account for that prior distribution. Victoria would receive a token inheritance of $10,000 and several items of sentimental value. The remainder of the estate, including the house, the savings, the investments, and the truck collection, would go to Emma Foster, with the understanding that this distribution balanced what had already been given. I sat there frozen, trying to process what I just heard. Uncle James let out a slow breath next to me, something between relief and vindication. Victoria's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, disbelief, anger, and finally a kind of desperate panic. She stood up so fast her chair scraped against the floor. "That can't be right," she said, her voice shaking. "There has to be a mistake. They wouldn't do that." Mr. Hampton looked at her over his glasses, patient but firm. "There's no mistake, Miss Foster. Your parents were very clear about their intentions. They consulted with me extensively when drafting this version of the will. They wanted to ensure both daughters were treated equitably, accounting for gifts already given." Victoria turned to me, her eyes wide and accusing. "Did you know about this? Did you manipulate them into changing the will?" I stared at her, too stunned to even be angry. "I had no idea. I haven't talked to them about money since you got the house." She wasn't listening. She turned back to Mr. Hampton, her voice rising. "This isn't fair. That money for the house was a gift, not an inheritance. They said it was a gift. They can't just take it back now." Mr. Hampton remained calm, the kind of calm that comes from years of dealing with family drama in sterile office settings. "They didn't take anything back. They accounted for it in their estate planning. This is entirely legal and entirely what they wanted." Derek, who'd been silent up until this point, finally spoke up. His voice had that condescending real estate agent tone, the one that assumes everyone else is stupid. We should contest this. Clearly there was undue influence. Emma was living with them at the end. She had access. She could have pressured them. Uncle James stood up then, and despite being in his 50s and retired, he still had that firefighter presence, the kind that makes you think twice about pushing further. Watch yourself, he said quietly. Emma was there because she was taking care of them while your wife was posting pictures of her lunch on the internet. Don't you dare suggest she manipulated anyone. The room was electric with tension. Mr. Hampton raised a hand, a gesture meant to calm everyone down. I understand this is emotional, but I assure you Mr. and Mrs. Foster were of sound mind when they updated this will. I have documentation of their mental capacity, notes from our consultations. Everything needed to demonstrate this was their decision, made freely and without coercion. If you wish to contest it, that's your right, but I should warn you that will be expensive, time-consuming, and unlikely to succeed given the evidence. Victoria looked like she was going to explode. Her face was red, her hands were shaking, and I could see her trying to figure out her next move. Finally, she grabbed her purse, looked at me with pure hatred and said, "This isn't over." Then she stormed out, Derek following behind after shooting Uncle James, a look that was probably supposed to be threatening but just looked pathetic. The door slammed and the office fell silent. Mr. Hampton sighed, took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "I'm sorry you had to witness that," he said. "Unfortunately, it's not uncommon in these situations." I found my voice finally, though it came out smaller than I intended. "Why didn't they tell me? Why didn't they say anything before they died?" He looked at me with something like sympathy. I asked them the same thing. "Your father said he didn't want to cause conflict while they were alive. He hoped that by the time the will was read, enough time would have passed that Victoria would understand." He paused. I told him that was optimistic. I almost laughed, but came out as something closer to a sob. Uncle James put his hand on my shoulder, steady and grounding. The next few days were surreal. I went through the motions at work, taught my lessons, graded papers, smiled at my students, and tried to pretend my entire world hadn't just shifted on its axis. Uncle James helped me start the process of dealing with the estate, contacting insurance companies, setting up meetings with the bank, all the tedious administrative tasks that come with inheriting someone's entire life. The house in Salem sat empty, filled with decades of my parents' belongings, and I couldn't bring myself to go there yet. Felt too big, too final, too much like admitting they were really gone. Victoria, meanwhile, had gone silent. No calls, no texts, nothing. I should have known better than to think she'd given up. The first sign something was wrong came in the form of a Facebook post. I didn't even use Facebook much anymore, but my friend Jasmine, who taught 3rd grade at my school, called me one evening in a panic. "Emma, you need to see what your sister is posting." She sent me screenshots and I felt my stomach drop. Victoria had written a long post about grief and family and betrayal. She didn't name me directly, but she didn't have to. She wrote about how hard it was to lose both parents, how she was still processing the trauma, and how sometimes the people you trust most are the ones who hurt you deepest. She talked about feeling abandoned by family, about legal battles and stolen inheritances, about manipulation and greed. The post had dozens of comments, mostly from people I didn't know, her Lake Oswego friends and Instagram followers, all offering sympathy and outrage on her behalf. "Poor Victoria," one person wrote. "Family can be so cruel." Another said, "You deserve better, stay strong." I read through the comments feeling sick. She was painting herself as the victim, twisting the story to make me look like I'd swooped in at the end of our parents' lives and stolen what was rightfully hers. It was a lie, but it was a convincing one, especially to people who didn't know the full story. Jasmine was furious on my behalf. "You need to respond," she said. "You need to set the record straight." But what was I supposed to say? Post my own version of events, air our family's dirty laundry on social media, get into a public fight with my sister while I was supposed to be grieving? I told Jasmine I'd think about it, but I already knew I wouldn't. Victoria wanted a spectacle, wanted attention and sympathy and validation. I wasn't going to give her that. Uncle James had a different reaction when I showed him the post. He stared at his phone screen for a long moment, his jaw tight, then looked at me and said, "She's going to escalate. This is just the beginning." I wanted to believe he was wrong, but deep down I knew he was right. Victoria had never been good at accepting no for an answer, and now she had an audience cheering her on, feeding into her narrative that she'd been wronged. The next escalation came a week later in the form of a phone call from my cousin Diane, Dad's niece who lived in Seattle. Her voice was hesitant, uncomfortable. "Hey Emma. I just wanted to reach out because Victoria called me yesterday." She paused, clearly not sure how to continue. "She said you'd taken advantage of your parents at the end, that you'd isolated them and manipulated them into changing the will. She's asking family members to support her if she decides to contest it legally." My hands went cold. "She's calling people? Trying to build a case?" Diane sighed. "I told her I didn't want to get involved, that this was between you two, but she was pretty insistent. She made it sound really bad, Emma. Like you'd done something terrible." I felt anger rising in my chest, hot and sharp. "Diane, I was there every single day taking care of them while Victoria showed up maybe once a month. I didn't even know about the will until after they died." There was a pause, then Diane's voice came back softer. "I believe you. I just thought you should know what she's saying." We hung up and I immediately called Uncle James. He wasn't surprised. "She's going scorched earth," he said. "Trying to turn the family against you, make you look like the bad guy so if she does contest the will, she has people backing her story." "What do I do?" I asked, hating how helpless I sounded. "You tell the truth to anyone who asks," he said firmly. "And you don't engage with her drama. Let her spin her wheels. The will is solid and she doesn't have a case. But that doesn't mean she won't try." Over the next 2 weeks, I heard from 3 more relatives. Some were genuinely concerned, asking if I was okay, and if there was anything they could do. Others were more accusatory, asking why I'd let things get so messy, why I couldn't just share the inheritance fairly, why family had to be so complicated. I answered honestly when I could, explaining the situation without trash-talking Victoria, even though I wanted to. I told them about the $100,000 for the house, about the will being updated years ago, about how I'd had no knowledge or involvement in any of it. Some people understood. Others didn't want to. It's easier to believe a simple story about greed and manipulation than to acknowledge the complex reality of parental favoritism and long-term family dysfunction. Then Victoria posted again. This time it was a photo of her and our parents from years ago, all 3 of them smiling at some family gathering I probably took the picture for. The caption was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive manipulation, missing the days when family actually meant something, before lawyers and greed got involved, before some people showed their true colors. "I'm fighting for what's right, not for me, but for the memory of 2 people who deserved better than this." The comments section exploded. People I'd never met were calling me terrible names, saying I should be ashamed, that I'd betrayed my family. A few people who actually knew me tried to defend me in the comments, but they were drowned out by Victoria's followers, her echo chamber of people who only knew her carefully curated version of reality. Jasmine saw it before I did and came over to my apartment that evening with a bottle of wine and a fierce expression. "You need to do something," she said, pouring us both a glass. "This is character assassination. She's destroying your reputation." "I don't care about my reputation with her Instagram followers," I said. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't entirely true. It did bother me. Not because I cared what strangers thought, but because Victoria was rewriting history, making our parents' final wishes sound like something sinister. Jasmine sat next to me on my worn couch, her expression serious. What if she actually contests the will? What if this social media campaign is just the warm-up? I didn't have an answer. Uncle James had said the will was solid, but legal battles took time and money and emotional energy, all things I was running short on. The thought of spending months or years fighting Victoria in court, of having to prove I hadn't manipulated my dying parents, made me feel sick. But what choice did I have? I couldn't just give her what she wanted, couldn't just hand over the inheritance because she was louder and more persistent. That's what she was counting on, that I'd be so exhausted and overwhelmed that I'd cave just to make it stop. But I thought about Uncle James, about his steady presence and his refusal to let Victoria's manipulation go unchallenged. I thought about my dad, about the way he'd squeezed my hand during those long hospice nights, about the trust he'd placed in me by leaving me the bulk of the estate. And I thought about myself, about the woman I'd become despite being the less favored child, the one who worked hard and showed up and didn't expect anything to be handed to her. I wasn't going to let Victoria take that away. The legal letter arrived on a Wednesday morning, delivered by a courier who made me sign for it like I was accepting a bomb. I stood in my apartment doorway holding the thick envelope, my name printed in official-looking font across the front, and I knew before opening it what it would say. Victoria was contesting the will. I called Uncle James immediately, my hands shaking as I tried to read the dense legal language. He told me to sit down, take a breath, and read it slowly. The petition claimed that our parents had been under undue influence during the time the will was updated, that I had isolated them from Victoria and manipulated them into changing their estate plan to favor me. It claimed that the previous will, which presumably split things more evenly, reflected their true wishes, and that the updated version was the result of coercion during a vulnerable time in their lives. It was all lies, but they were lies wrapped in legal terminology that made them sound almost plausible. The petition requested that the court invalidate the current will and either reinstate a previous version or divide the estate equally between Victoria and myself, accounting for nothing that had come before. Attached to the petition were several affidavits, statements from people swearing to various facts that supposedly supported Victoria's case. I recognized some of the names. Diane's sister Karen, who I'd met maybe twice in my life. A neighbor of my parents who apparently told Victoria that I'd been aggressive and controlling during Dad's illness. Derek's brother, who claimed to have witnessed me preventing Victoria from visiting our parents, which was such an outrageous lie I actually laughed out loud despite the circumstances. Uncle James drove over within an hour. He read through the entire petition sitting at my tiny kitchen table, his expression getting darker with each page. When he finished, he looked up at me and said, "This is garbage. Every single claim in here is either a lie or a wild distortion of reality. Any lawyer worth their salt will tear this apart." I wanted to believe him, but the fear was already settling into my bones. Legal battles weren't won by truth alone. They were won by whoever had the better lawyer, the more convincing story, the resources to keep fighting. I was a public school teacher living paycheck to paycheck. Victoria was married to a real estate agent with connections and apparently enough money to hire an attorney willing to file this petition. What if the court believed her? What if some judge who didn't know either of us looked at the situation and saw a younger sister who'd swooped in at the end and convinced dying parents to change their will? Uncle James must have seen the panic on my face because he reached across the table and gripped my hand. "Emma, listen to me. Your parents knew exactly what they were doing. Hampton has documentation proving it. Medical records showing they were mentally sound. Notes from their consultations. This isn't going to hold up, but you need a good lawyer to make sure of it." That's how I ended up in another lawyer's office 3 days later. This time meeting with Rebecca Torres, an estate litigation attorney Uncle James had found through a friend. Her office was smaller than Hampton's, less fancy, but somehow more reassuring. The walls were lined with law books instead of expensive art, and her desk was covered in organized stacks of files that suggested someone who actually worked rather than just looked important. Rebecca was in her 40s, sharp-eyed and direct, and she didn't waste time with pleasantries. She read through Victoria's petition while I sat across from her, trying not to fidget. When she finished, she set it down and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Your sister is really reaching here," she said. "Most of these claims are completely unfounded, and the affidavits are weak. But I won't lie to you, cases like this can drag on and they're expensive, even when they're baseless." She explained that fighting the petition would require gathering evidence, deposing witnesses, potentially going to trial if Victoria pushed hard enough. She quoted me a retainer fee that made my stomach drop, then explained her hourly rate, and I did the math in my head, realizing this could eat up a significant chunk of the estate I was supposed to be inheriting. It felt like Victoria was holding the inheritance hostage, forcing me to spend money defending what should have been mine just to prove she was lying. Rebecca must have seen my expression because she leaned back in her chair and said, "Look, I've been doing this for 15 years. Family estate disputes are ugly, and they bring out the worst in people. But the law is pretty clear here. Your parents had the right to distribute their estate however they wanted. They documented their decision-making. They were mentally competent. Unless your sister can prove actual coercion or fraud, which based on this petition she can't, she doesn't have a case." I hired her because I didn't have another choice, and because Uncle James offered to help with the costs if it came to that. The next few weeks were a nightmare of documentation and preparation. Rebecca requested everything: Medical records proving my parents' mental capacity, bank statements showing I hadn't touched their money, phone records demonstrating I hadn't prevented Victoria from calling them, testimony from hospice workers and doctors and anyone else who'd witnessed the final months of my parents' lives. Mr. Hampton provided his files, including detailed notes from his consultations with my parents where they'd explicitly discussed the $100,000 gift to Victoria and their desire to balance the inheritance accordingly. One note in particular stood out. My dad had apparently told Hampton, "Victoria has always needed more help and we gave it to her. But Emma has built her own life, and we want to make sure she has something to build on. This feels fair." Reading my father's words in Hampton's careful handwriting broke something open in me. He'd known. He'd seen. The imbalance, had tried in his own inadequate way to correct it at the end. It didn't make up for all the years of favoritism, all the times I'd been overlooked or dismissed, but it was something. It was acknowledgement. I provided my own testimony, walking Rebecca through everything. The years of watching Victoria get more, the $100,000 for the house, my parents' refusals to help me, the months I'd spent caring for them while Victoria was absent, the will reading where I'd learned for the first time that things would be different. Rebecca recorded everything, took notes, asked probing questions to make sure my story would hold up under cross-examination. She was thorough to the point of being exhausting, but I appreciated it. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about defending my parents' wishes and my own integrity. Meanwhile, Victoria's social media campaign continued. She posted about the emotional toll of legal battles, about fighting for justice, about how hard it was to grieve while also having to defend yourself against family betrayal. She never named me directly, maintaining just enough plausible deniability, but everyone who followed her knew exactly who she was talking about. Her comment sections became echo chambers of support, people who didn't know anything about the situation offering sympathy and encouragement. A few people started leaving negative reviews on my school's Facebook page, claiming I was a terrible person who shouldn't be around children, which was so absurd and malicious it took my breath away. My principal called me into her office, not to reprimand me but to ask if everything was okay, and I had to explain that my sister was trying to destroy my reputation as part of a legal dispute. It was humiliating. Jasmine became my lifeline during this time. She'd come over after work, bring takeout I was too stressed to cook, and let me vent about the latest absurdity in Victoria's campaign. She helped me draft a statement for social media. Something brief and dignified that didn't engage with the drama, but made it clear I was honoring my parents' wishes. I never posted it. Every time I tried, I'd read it over and realize Victoria would just twist it, use it as ammunition, turn it into more content for her followers to dissect and judge. So I stayed silent publicly, which probably made me look guilty to people who didn't know better, but I didn't know what else to do. Uncle James said silence was strength, that letting Victoria scream into the void, while I focused on the actual legal case, was the right strategy. I wanted to believe him. The deposition happened 6 weeks after the petition was filed. Rebecca had warned me it would be uncomfortable, that Victoria's attorney would try to make me look bad, and that I needed to stay calm and stick to the facts no matter what. We met in a conference room at the opposing counsel's office, a space that felt deliberately intimidating with its long table and harsh lighting. Victoria was already there when I arrived, sitting next to her lawyer, a man in his 50s named Richard Castellano who looked like he charged by the minute just to breathe. She wouldn't look at me directly, kept her eyes fixed on the table or her phone, playing the part of the wounded party. Derek sat in the corner, arms crossed, radiating hostility. Uncle James sat next to me, and his presence was the only thing keeping me from walking out. Castellano started the deposition with basic questions. My name, my age, my occupation, my relationship to the deceased. Then he moved into more pointed territory. When had I moved in with my parents? Why had I taken a leave of absence from work? How often had Victoria been allowed to visit? The questions were designed to suggest I'd taken over my parents' lives, had positioned myself as the primary caregiver not out of love but out of calculation. I answered each question as calmly as I could, stating facts, refusing to rise to the bait. When he asked why I thought my parents had changed their will, I said, "You'd have to ask them, but since they're dead, the best evidence we have is what they told their attorney, which is documented in Mr. Hampton's files." Castellano didn't like that answer. He pressed harder, asking if I'd ever discussed the will with my parents, If I'd ever suggested they should leave me more, if I'd ever complained about the money Victoria had received for her house. I told him the truth. I'd asked my parents once years ago why they'd given Victoria $100,000 and not offered me anything. I'd been told it would all balance out eventually. I hadn't brought it up again because I'd learned long ago that asking my parents for anything just led to disappointment. Castellano tried to twist that, suggesting I'd been harboring resentment, that I'd used my position as caregiver to exact revenge. Rebecca objected, stating that my emotional response to years of unequal treatment wasn't relevant to whether my parents had been coerced. The deposition went on for 3 hours. Castellano asked about my relationship with Victoria, about our childhood, about specific incidents where I'd supposedly been hostile toward her. Some of his questions were based on statements from Victoria's affidavits, and I had to sit there listening to lies framed as facts. No, I never prevented Victoria from visiting our parents. No, I never told hospice workers that Victoria wasn't welcome. No, I never discussed inheritance with Dad while he was on morphine. Each denial felt like pulling teeth, and I could see Victoria in my peripheral vision, nodding along with her lawyer's questions like they were truth. When it was finally over, Rebecca told me I'd done well, that I'd stayed composed and consistent. But I felt hollowed out, exhausted in a way that sleep couldn't fix. Uncle James drove me home and didn't say much, just walked me to my door and told me to get some rest. I couldn't. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every question, every implication, wondering if I'd said something wrong, if I'd given Castellano ammunition to use against me. The legal process ground on slowly, each week bringing new filings, new responses, new motions. Victoria's side requested financial records going back 5 years, trying to find some evidence that I'd been improperly involved in my parents' finances. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. Rebecca filed motions to dismiss, arguing that Victoria's petition lacked merit and that my parents' wishes as documented in the will should be honored. The court set a hearing date 3 months out, which felt like an eternity. During those months, I tried to maintain some semblance of normal life. I taught my second graders, graded their spelling tests, organized a field trip to the Oregon Zoo. Those kids were the only part of my life that felt uncomplicated, and I clung to that. But the stress was wearing me down. I lost weight I couldn't afford to lose, stopped sleeping more than a few hours a night, jumped every time my phone rang thinking it might be Rebecca with bad news. Uncle James checked on me constantly, brought me dinners I picked at, reminded me that this would end eventually. I wanted to believe him, but Victoria's campaign showed no signs of stopping. She posted a photo of our parents' house with a caption about how hard it was to be locked out of your childhood home, which was rich considering she barely set foot there in the last decade. She implied I'd changed the locks to keep her away, which wasn't true. I hadn't even been to the house yet. It sat empty in Salem, full of memories I wasn't ready to face, while Victoria used it as a prop in her victim narrative. Then something shifted. Rebecca called me on a Tuesday evening, her voice carrying an edge of satisfaction. "We just got the deposition transcript from the neighbor who claimed you were controlling and aggressive. Castellano didn't prep her well enough." Under questioning, she admitted she'd only talked to your parents maybe 3 times in the last year, always brief conversations over the fence. She has no actual knowledge of your behavior in the house or your interactions with Victoria. Her entire affidavit is based on things Victoria told her, not things she witnessed. I felt a flutter of hope. What does that mean? Rebecca's smile was audible through the phone. It means their case is even weaker than we thought. If their witness testimony is all hearsay, based on Victoria's claims rather than actual observation, it won't hold up. I'm filing a motion to exclude these affidavits as evidence, and I'm betting the judge will grant it. More good news came a week later. The hospice nurse who'd been with my parents during their final weeks had provided a statement completely contradicting Victoria's claims. She described me as devoted and exhausted, sleeping on the couch to be near my father, coordinating his care with meticulous attention. She also noted that Victoria had visited rarely, and when she did, the visits were brief and seemed performative. The nurse's statement was detailed and credible, exactly the kind of testimony that could dismantle Victoria's narrative. Rebecca was building a strong case, but she warned me not to get overconfident. Your sister's attorney is desperate, and desperate lawyers do stupid things. Be prepared for them to get uglier before this is over. She was right. The next salvo came in the form of a subpoena for my personal journals. Victoria's side had somehow found out I kept a journal, something I'd done sporadically over the years, and they wanted access to it. They claimed it might contain evidence of my true feelings toward my parents and Victoria, evidence that could support their undue influence theory. I was horrified. My journal was private, full of raw emotions and unfiltered thoughts, things I'd never intended anyone else to read. Rebecca fought the subpoena, arguing it was overly broad and invasive, but the judge granted a limited version of it. I had to turn over entries from the 2 years surrounding my parents' deaths. I spent an evening reading through those entries before handing them over, and what I found surprised me. Yes, there was anger and frustration, but there was also love. I'd written about Dad's laugh, about the way Mom used to hum while she cooked, about small moments of connection that had meant everything to me. I'd written about Victoria too, about my hurt over her absence, but also about my hope that maybe this crisis would bring us closer, that maybe she'd show up and be the sister I'd always wanted her to be. The entries were honest but not damning. They showed someone struggling with complex emotions, not someone plotting to steal an inheritance. When Castellano got the journal entries, he tried to use them anyway. He pulled quotes out of context, presented them as evidence of my resentment and calculation. One entry where I'd written, "I can't do this anymore," after a particularly hard night with Dad, became, in his argument, evidence that I was tired of caregiving and motivated by the prospect of inheritance. Rebecca tore that argument apart in her response, providing the full context of the entry, which continued with, "But I will because he's my dad and I love him." The hearing date approached, and I felt like I was living in a countdown. 60 days, 40 days, 20 days. Rebecca prepared me for what to expect, explaining that this would be a preliminary hearing where the judge would decide whether Victoria's petition had enough merit to proceed to a full trial. If we were lucky, the judge would dismiss it outright, saving us months of additional fighting. If not, we'd be in for a long battle. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep at all. I lay in bed running through everything in my mind. Every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every argument Rebecca planned to make. I thought about my parents, wondered what they'd think of all this, whether they'd regret their decision to try to balance things out at the end. Part of me wished they'd just left everything 50-50, avoided this entire mess. But another part of me, the part that had spent a lifetime being the afterthought, was grateful they'd finally acknowledged the imbalance. They'd finally seen me. Uncle James picked me up early the next morning. I dressed in the same professional outfit I'd worn to the will reading, something that felt appropriate for standing in front of a judge and defending my integrity. We met Rebecca at the courthouse, an imposing building downtown with marble steps and columns that made everything feel more serious, more final. Victoria was already there, of course, standing with Derek and Castellano near the entrance. She looked polished and fragile, wearing a black dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent and carrying a tissue she dabbed at her eyes periodically. When she saw me, something flickered across her face, too quick to identify, and then she turned away like I wasn't worth acknowledging. We went through security and made our way to the courtroom, a formal space with wood paneling and a raised bench where the judge would sit. There were a handful of other people present. Court staff, a stenographer, Mr. Hampton who'd come to provide testimony if needed. We sat on opposite sides of the room, Victoria's side and mine, like we were getting ready for battle. In a way we were. The judge entered, a woman in her 60s named Judge Patricia Winters, and everyone stood. She had the kind of face that gave nothing away, and I couldn't tell if that was good or bad for us. She called the case, asked both attorneys to present their arguments, and the hearing began. Castellano went first, laying out Victoria's case in language that made it sound almost reasonable. He talked about a vulnerable elderly couple, isolated from their older daughter by a younger daughter who'd positioned herself as the sole caregiver. He talked about a will that had been changed under suspicious circumstances, leaving one daughter with almost nothing while the other received everything. He presented it as a story of manipulation and greed, and if you didn't know the actual facts, it might have been compelling. Then Rebecca stood up, and I watched her dismantle Victoria's case piece by piece. She started with the documentation from Mr. Hampton, the detailed note showing my parents were fully competent when they updated their will, showing they'd initiated the changes themselves, showing they'd been clear about their reasoning. She presented the $100,000 gift to Victoria, documented and undeniable, and explained how my parents had viewed it as an early inheritance that needed to be accounted for. She showed the hospice nurse's statement, the medical records, the phone logs proving Victoria had rarely called or visited during our parents' final months. She methodically addressed each of Victoria's claims, showing how they were either false or based on hearsay from witnesses who had no actual knowledge of what they were testifying about. Judge Winters listened to everything, asking occasional questions, taking notes. When both sides had presented their arguments, she asked if there were any witnesses to call. Rebecca called Mr. Hampton, who testified about his consultations with my parents, about their mental state, about their explicit intentions regarding the will. Under cross-examination, Castellano tried to suggest that Hampton had been influenced by me, that I'd somehow manipulated the lawyer too, but Hampton shut that down quickly. "I've been practicing estate law for 30 years, he said calmly. "I know undue influence when I see it, and there was none here." Robert and Patricia Foster knew exactly what they wanted, and they were adamant about it. Castellano called Victoria to the stand next, and I watched my sister walk to the witness box like she was heading to an audition. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and I wondered if she even understood what truth meant anymore. Her testimony was a masterclass in selective memory and emotional manipulation. She talked about how close she'd been to our parents, how much she'd loved them, how devastated she was by their deaths. She painted a picture of herself as a devoted daughter who'd been pushed aside by a scheming younger sister. When Castellano asked her about the $100,000, she described it as a gift given freely, something our parents had insisted on. Not an early inheritance but simply help when she and Derek needed it most. She made it sound like I'd somehow poisoned our parents against her, convinced them to cut her out of the will out of spite. Rebecca's cross-examination was surgical. She started gently, asking Victoria about specific dates, specific visits during our parents' illness. Victoria's answers were vague, full of phrases like, "I think it was around that time," and "I tried to visit as much as I could." Rebecca pulled out phone records, visitor logs from the hospice service, evidence that contradicted nearly everything Victoria claimed. "According to these records, you visited your father 3 times during his 8-month illness. Is that correct?" Victoria's face flushed. "I was dealing with a lot. Derek was sick too, and I couldn't always get away." Rebecca nodded, consulting her notes. "Write Derek's illness. Can you provide medical records documenting his condition during that time?" Victoria hesitated. "It was never officially diagnosed. He was just really run down, exhausted all the time." Rebecca let that hang in the air for a moment. "So no medical records, no doctor visits, no documentation of this illness that prevented you from seeing your dying father?" Castellano objected, claiming Rebecca was badgering the witness, but Judge Winters overruled him. Victoria stumbled through the rest of her testimony, and with each question, her story unraveled a little more. When Rebecca asked her about the social media posts, about the campaign she'd waged against me online, Victoria tried to claim she'd never mentioned me specifically, that she'd just been processing her grief publicly. Rebecca pulled up screenshots, read some of the comments Victoria had liked and responded to, comments that clearly identified me as the villain in her story. "Were you processing grief, Miss Foster? Or were you trying to turn public opinion against your sister to support this legal challenge?" Victoria's eyes welled with tears and she said quietly, "I was hurting. I still am." It was a good performance and I could see it was affecting some people in the courtroom, but Rebecca pressed on. "You've testified that you loved your parents deeply. Can you tell me what medication your father was taking in his final weeks?" Victoria blinked, caught off guard. "I don't remember exactly. There were a lot of medications." Rebecca nodded. "Your sister can name every medication, every dosage, every side effect. She administered them. She was there. Where were you?" Castellano objected again, but the damage was done. Judge Winters called a brief recess, and we filed out into the hallway. Uncle James put his arm around my shoulders and said, "She's falling apart up there. Rebecca is destroying her." I wanted to feel triumphant, but mostly I just felt sad. This was my sister, the person I'd grown up with, and we were standing in a courtroom treating each other like enemies. When we returned, Rebecca called Uncle James to the stand. He testified about the family dynamics, about the years of favoritism toward Victoria, about how I'd been the one who showed up when it mattered. His testimony was straightforward and credible, and Castellano couldn't shake it during cross-examination. Then Rebecca called me. Walking to the witness stand felt like moving through water, everything slow and surreal. I placed my hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, then sat down and tried to steady my breathing. Rebecca started with easy questions, establishing the timeline of my parents' illness, my role as caregiver, my relationship with them. Then she asked me directly, "Emma, did you ever discuss the contents of the will with your parents?" I shook my head. No. I didn't even know what was in it until after they died. She asked me about the journal entries, about the emotions I'd expressed in those private pages. I explained that yes, I'd been angry sometimes, frustrated and exhausted and overwhelmed, but that didn't mean I'd manipulated anyone. I loved my parents, I said, my voice cracking slightly. Taking care of them was the hardest thing I've ever done, but I did it because they were my parents and they needed me, not because I wanted their money. I didn't even think I'd get anything after watching Victoria receive so much over the years. Rebecca asked me about the $100,000 Victoria had received for her house. How did you feel when you found out your parents had given your sister that money, but refused to help you when you asked? I took a breath. I felt hurt. I felt like I didn't matter as much. But I also wasn't surprised. That was the pattern my whole life. Victoria needed, Victoria got. I learned to do without. I could see Victoria across the courtroom, her face tight with anger, and I kept going. But I made peace with it. I built my own life and I was okay. When my parents got sick, I didn't help them to get something in return. I helped them because that's what you do for family. Castellano's cross-examination was aggressive. He tried to paint me as resentful and calculating, someone who'd kept score my entire life and finally saw an opportunity to tip the scales in my favor. He brought up the journal entries again, the moments of anger and frustration, and tried to use them as evidence of a long-term grudge. I stayed calm, answered each question honestly. Yes, I felt hurt by the way my parents treated me compared to Victoria, but that didn't make me scheme against anyone. It made me sad. There's a difference. He asked why I'd taken a leave of absence from work to care for my parents if I wasn't expecting something in return. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "Because they were dying, and I loved them and someone needed to be there. Victoria wasn't going to do it." He asked if I'd ever told my parents they should change their will. Never. Not once. He asked if I prevented Victoria from visiting. No. She was always welcome. She just didn't come. The questions went on and I answered each one, refusing to let him twist my words or my intentions. When I finally stepped down from the witness stand, I felt drained but steady. I told the truth, all of it, and there was nothing more I could do. Judge Winters asked if there were any more witnesses. Both attorneys said no. She looked at her notes, then at both legal teams, then at Victoria and me. "I'm going to take a brief recess to review the evidence and testimony. We'll reconvene in 30 minutes for my decision." Those 30 minutes felt like hours. We sat in the hallway, nobody talking much, the tension thick enough to cut. Rebecca looked confident but not cocky, going over her notes one more time. Uncle James sat next to me, a solid presence that kept me grounded. Across the hall, Victoria was in deep conversation with Castellano and Derek, her expression anxious. When we were called back in, everyone took their places. Judge Winters entered, and the room fell silent. She looked at both sides, her expression neutral, and began speaking. "I've reviewed all the evidence presented today, including the testimony of witnesses, the documentation regarding Mr. and Mrs. Foster's mental capacity, and the claims made in the petition to contest the will." She paused, and I felt my heart hammering in my chest. This is a case about family dynamics, parental favoritism, and ultimately about the right of individuals to distribute their estate as they see fit. The law is clear. A person has the right to leave their property to whomever they choose, for whatever reason they choose, as long as they are of sound mind and not subject to undue influence or coercion. She looked directly at Victoria. The petitioner has failed to provide credible evidence of undue influence. The documentation shows clearly that Robert and Patricia Foster were mentally competent when they updated their will. They consulted with their attorney extensively, and their reasoning was sound. They had previously given the petitioner a substantial gift of $100,000, which they viewed as an early inheritance, and they wished to balance that gift in their final distribution. Judge Winters continued, her voice firm and clear. The testimony from the hospice nurse, the medical professionals, and Mr. Hampton all support the conclusion that Mr. and Mrs. Foster made this decision freely and with full understanding of what they were doing. The petitioner's claims that her sister prevented her from visiting or manipulated their parents are not supported by the evidence. In fact, the evidence shows the opposite, that Emma Foster was the primary caregiver during a difficult time, while Victoria Foster was largely absent. I felt tears starting to form, but I held them back. Furthermore, the judge said, the affidavits provided by the petitioner are largely based on hearsay or lack sufficient foundation. The witnesses admitted under questioning that their knowledge of the situation was limited or based entirely on information provided by the petitioner herself, not on direct observation. Judge Winters looked at the papers in front of her one more time. Based on all of this, I find that the petitioner has not met her burden of proof. The will executed by Robert and Patricia Foster is valid and reflects their true intentions. The petition to contest the will is denied. The gavel came down, and the sound echoed through the courtroom. I sat there stunned, unable to process what had just happened. We'd won. Rebecca turned to me with a smile. It's over, Emma. The will stands. Uncle James pulled me into a hug, and I finally let the tears fall, not from sadness but from relief, from the release of months of tension and fear. Across the aisle, Victoria was crying too, but her tears were different, angry and bitter. Castellano was packing up his briefcase quickly, probably already planning his exit strategy. Derek looked furious, his jaw clenched, his hands balled into fists. Judge Winters wasn't finished though. I'd also like to note, she said, and the room quieted again, that this court takes seriously the filing of frivolous or bad faith petitions. The evidence suggests that this challenge was not based on legitimate concerns about undue influence, but rather on disappointment with the distribution of the estate. While I understand emotions run high in family disputes, using the court system to relitigate decisions that were made fairly and legally is not appropriate. She looked at Castellano. I'm ordering the petitioner to pay the respondent's reasonable attorney fees and costs associated with defending against this petition. The exact amount will be determined at a separate hearing, but I want to make clear that actions have consequences. Victoria's face went white. Attorney fees could run into tens of thousands of dollars, money she probably didn't have, especially after paying Castellano for this failed attempt. The judge stood and everyone rose. She left the courtroom and suddenly there was movement, noise, people gathering their things. Victoria stood up and looked at me across the room, and for a moment our eyes met. I saw rage there and hurt, and something else I couldn't identify. She opened her mouth like she was going to say something, then seemed to think better of it. Instead, she turned and walked out, Derek and Castellano following behind her. Uncle James, Rebecca, and I stood there for a moment in the emptying courtroom. What happens now? I asked Rebecca. She smiled. Now we file for those attorney fees, finalize the estate distribution, and you get to move on with your life. The inheritance is yours, Emma. Your parents' wishes are being honored. We walked out into the bright afternoon, and I felt like I could breathe properly for the first time in months. The weight that had been pressing down on me was lifting, not completely, but enough that I could stand up straight again. Over the next few weeks, things moved quickly. The court ordered Victoria to pay just over $40,000 in attorney fees, a sum that must have been devastating given her financial situation. She and Derek listed their Lake Oswego house for sale a month later, presumably to cover the costs. I felt a twinge of something, not quite satisfaction but close to it, knowing that the house our parents had paid for was now going to pay for Victoria's failed attempt to take even more from them. The estate was distributed according to the will. The house in Salem, which I still hadn't been able to face going into, was put on the market. Uncle James helped me sort through decades of belongings, deciding what to keep, what to donate, what to let go of. We found photo albums documenting our childhood, and looking through them was painful. There were pictures of Victoria and me as kids, smiling together, arms around each other, looking like normal sisters. I wondered when exactly things had gone so wrong. Or if they'd always been wrong and I just hadn't seen it yet. Dad's truck collection went to a specialized dealer who found buyers for all three vehicles. The vintage Chevy pickup, the one I'd always loved, I kept for myself even though I had nowhere to put it. Uncle James offered to store it in his workshop, and sometimes I'd go over there just to sit in it, running my hands over the steering wheel Dad had gripped thousands of times, feeling close to him in a way I hadn't felt since he died. The savings and investment accounts were transferred to my name, and seeing that money in my bank account felt surreal. I'd gone from living paycheck to having financial security I'd never imagined. The first thing I did was pay off my student loans in full, every penny of debt that had been hanging over me for years. The second thing I did was set up a college fund, not for kids I didn't have yet, but for my students, the ones whose families couldn't afford to send them to college, the ones who reminded me of myself. Uncle James cried when I told him about it. I quit my job at Meadowbrook Elementary, not because I stopped loving teaching, but because I needed a break, needed time to process everything that had happened. I traveled for the first time in my life, took a trip to Ireland that my mom had always wanted to take but never did, scattered some of her ashes on a cliff overlooking the ocean like she'd mentioned once in passing years ago. I spent a month in a cottage in the countryside, writing in my journal, hiking through green fields, trying to figure out who I was now that the fight was over. When I came back to Portland, I bought a small house in a quiet neighborhood, nothing fancy but mine, with a yard and a porch and enough space to breathe. Uncle James helped me move in, and we celebrated with pizza and beer sitting on my new back deck watching the sun set. "Your dad would be proud of you," he said quietly. "You fought for what was right and you won." I wanted to believe that, but part of me wondered if Dad would have been heartbroken to know his daughters had ended up in court, destroying whatever relationship we'd had left. I thought about reaching out to Victoria, trying one more time to bridge the gap between us, but I didn't know what I'd say. "Sorry you tried to steal my inheritance and lost? I hope you're doing okay, even though you spent months trying to destroy my reputation?" There were no words that could fix what had been broken, and maybe it had been broken all along, held together by nothing more than shared DNA and parental expectations. I saw her one more time, completely by accident, at a grocery store in Beaverton 6 months after the court case ended. I was picking up ingredients for a dinner I was hosting, Uncle James and Jasmine and a few other friends, the first time I'd felt social enough to have people over. I turned down the pasta aisle and there she was, standing in front of the shelves looking tired and older than I remembered. For a second we just stared at each other, and I didn't know what to do. She looked away first, grabbed a box of pasta without really looking at it, and walked away quickly, her cart squeaking as she pushed it. I stood there holding my shopping basket, feeling a complicated mix of emotions I couldn't untangle. Sadness, definitely. Relief that we didn't have to talk. Anger at everything that had happened. And underneath it all, a thread of grief for the sister relationship we'd never actually had. The one I'd wanted as a kid before I understood that Victoria would never be the person I needed her to be. I finished my shopping and drove home. And that night, surrounded by people who actually cared about me, I realized something important. Family isn't just about who you're born to, or who shares your last name. It's about who shows up. It's about who sits with you in hospitals and courtrooms and grocery store parking lots when you're falling apart. It's about who tells you the truth even when it's hard, who fights for you when you're too tired to fight for yourself, who celebrates your victories and mourns your losses like they're their own. Uncle James was more family to me than Victoria had ever been. Jasmine, who'd held my hand through the worst of it, was more of a sister than the one I'd grown up with. A year after the court case, I went back to teaching, but at a different school, one in a neighborhood that reminded me less of my childhood and more of the future I was building. My second graders were just as wonderful and exhausting as the ones before, and being back in a classroom felt like coming home to myself. I bought better supplies with my own money now, books and art materials and science kits, things my students deserved but the school budget couldn't provide. I started a mentoring program for kids who needed extra support, remembering what it felt like to be overlooked, to be the one nobody invested in. I made sure every single one of my students knew they mattered, that they were seen, that their dreams were valid and achievable. It became my mission, the thing that gave all the pain and struggle meaning. If I could help even one kid avoid feeling the way I'd felt growing up, invisible and less than, then everything I'd been through would be worth it. Uncle James and I grew even closer after everything settled. We had dinner together once a week, sometimes at my house, sometimes at his, and we'd talk about everything and nothing. He taught me woodworking and I made him try yoga, which was hilarious but also kind of sweet. He walked me through his workshop, pointing out every tool, explaining what each one did, showing me projects he was working on. And in those moments I felt the ghost of my father there too, the version of him that had existed before Victoria and I had become pawns in some unspoken competition for his approval. I asked Uncle James once if he thought my parents had loved me. We were sanding down a bookshelf together, the smell of wood dust heavy in the air, and the question just came out. He stopped working and looked at me with those steady eyes. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "They loved you. They just didn't know how to show it in a way that felt fair. They were flawed people who made mistakes and you paid the price for those mistakes. But they loved you, Emma. The will proved that. At the end they tried to make it right." I don't know if that makes it better or worse, knowing they loved me but still hurt me, still chose Victoria over and over until they couldn't anymore. But I'm learning to make peace with the complexity of it, to hold both truths at once. That my parents failed me in significant ways, and that they also gave me life and occasional moments of genuine connection, and ultimately tried to ensure my future was secure. It's messy and imperfect and human. I still think about Victoria sometimes, wonder how she's doing, whether she ever reflects on what happened with any kind of self-awareness. I saw on social media, through a friend who still follows her, that she and Derek moved to a smaller house in a less expensive area. That her Instagram posts are less frequent and less polished. Part of me feels sorry for her, for the way she's always needed external validation, for how empty that must be. But mostly I just feel distant from her. Like she's someone I used to know rather than someone I'm related to. Maybe that's the healthiest outcome. Accepting that not all family relationships can or should be saved. 2 years after my parents died, I met someone. His name was Colin. He taught high school history, and he had kind eyes and a quiet sense of humor that snuck up on you. We met at an education conference, bonded over complaints about standardized testing, and started dating slowly, carefully, both of us aware that we were bringing our own baggage to the relationship. When I told him about Victoria, about the court case and the inheritance battle, he listened without judgment and then said, "You're stronger than you think you are." Most people would have crumbled under that kind of pressure. It was one of the nicest things anyone had ever said to me. We got engaged a year later, and when Uncle James walked me down the aisle at our small wedding, I cried thinking about my dad, about how he should have been there but wasn't, about how life doesn't always give you the moments you want, but sometimes gives you the ones you need. Victoria wasn't invited to the wedding. I thought about it, agonized over whether to extend an olive branch, but ultimately decided that day needed to be about joy, not about managing someone else's emotions or risking drama. A few people asked where my sister was, and I just said we weren't close, which was the simplest truth. Colin's family more than made up for the absence of mine, welcoming me with open arms, treating me like I'd always been part of their story. His mom, a warm woman named Patricia, coincidentally sharing my mother's name, told me at the reception that she was glad Colin had found someone who understood the value of showing up. I hugged her and thought about all the different ways love can manifest, how sometimes the family you choose is better than the one you're born into. Now, 3 years after everything, I'm sitting in my home office, the one in the house my parents' inheritance allowed me to buy, writing this down because I want to remember. Not the pain exactly, though that's part of it, but the lesson underneath. I learned that wanting to be treated fairly isn't selfish. That asking for equity isn't the same as asking for handouts. That sometimes the people who are supposed to love you most are the ones who hurt you deepest. Not through malice necessarily, but through blindness, through their own limitations and failures. I learned that you can grieve someone and still be angry at them. That those emotions can coexist without canceling each other out. I learned that fighting back doesn't make you a bad person, that standing up for yourself is sometimes the most loving thing you can do, for yourself and for the memory of the people who tried, however inadequately, to make things right at the end. My parents gave Victoria $100,000 for her house, and gave me nothing but lectures about responsibility. But in the end they gave me something more valuable. They saw me, acknowledged the imbalance, and tried to correct it. It wasn't perfect and it came too late, but it was something. And I fought to honor that, to honor them, to honor myself. Victoria tried to take that away from me, tried to rewrite history and claim victimhood, but she failed because the truth mattered more than her performance. Because I had people in my corner who refused to let her manipulation win. Because I'd finally learned the difference between peace and surrender. And I chose the harder path. The inheritance itself, the money and the property, it's been life-changing. I'm not going to pretend it hasn't. But what mattered more was what it represented. Validation, recognition, justice. It was my parents saying finally, "We see you. You matter. Your life and your struggles and your quiet perseverance matters as much as your sister's loud demands." That's what I fought for, and that's what I won. So when people ask me about my sister, about why we're not in each other's lives anymore, I tell them a simplified version of this story. I tell them that sometimes families break, that not every relationship can or should be salvaged, that choosing peace over toxicity is not giving up, it's growing up. And when they look at me with pity, assuming I must be sad about it, I smile and tell them I'm not. I'm free. I'm finally completely free. The email arrived on a Thursday morning in late October, 5 years after the courthouse doors had closed on the worst chapter of my life. I was sitting at my kitchen table grading spelling tests, my coffee going cold in its mug, when my phone chimed with a notification I almost ignored. The sender's name made me freeze. Victoria Foster Mitchell. I stared at the screen for a full minute before opening it, my heart doing that old familiar dance of anxiety and dread that I thought I'd left behind. The subject line read simply, "Please read this." My finger hovered over the delete button. I'd spent 5 years building a life that didn't include Victoria, 5 years of peace and growth and healing, and part of me wanted to protect that at all costs. But curiosity, or maybe something deeper, made me open it. The email was long, longer than any communication Victoria had ever sent me. It started with an apology, which immediately made me suspicious because Victoria didn't apologize, not real apologies anyway, just the performative kind that shifted blame while pretending to take responsibility. But as I read, something felt different about this one. She wrote about the years since the court case, about how losing the Lake Oswego house had forced her and Derek to confront realities they'd been avoiding, how the financial pressure had exposed cracks in their marriage that had always been there, but were easier to ignore when money wasn't tight, how Derek had eventually left her for someone younger, someone who didn't come with legal debt and faded Instagram dreams. She wrote about hitting rock bottom, about having to move in with a friend because she couldn't afford rent, about taking a job at a call center because it was the only place that would hire her. She wrote about going to therapy, real therapy, not the kind you mention in social media posts to seem self-aware, but the kind where you sit in an uncomfortable chair and face uncomfortable truths about yourself. She wrote about slowly, painfully beginning to understand how her behavior had affected people, how her entitlement and manipulation had destroyed relationships that could have been meaningful. She wrote about our parents, about finally admitting to herself that they had enabled her worst qualities while expecting me to simply accept being treated as lesser. And then she wrote about me, about the court case, about the things she'd said and done, about the cruelty of her campaign against me. She didn't make excuses. She didn't blame her lawyer or Derek or the stress of grief. She just said she was sorry that she'd been wrong, that she understood if I never wanted to speak to her again, but felt I deserved to know that she recognized the harm she'd caused. I read the email 3 times, looking for the angle, the manipulation, the hidden agenda. Victoria always wanted something, and I couldn't quite believe this was different. But the tone was different, flatter somehow, less performative. There were no dramatic declarations, no requests for forgiveness, no suggestions that we try to repair our relationship. It was just an accounting of her actions and an acknowledgement of their impact. At the end, she wrote that she wasn't expecting a response, that she understood I had every right to delete this email and continue with my life, as though she didn't exist. She said she hoped I was happy, that she hoped I'd built the kind of life I deserved. And then she signed it simply Victoria, not with any of the flourishes or affectations she used to favor. I closed my laptop and sat there staring at the wall, feeling something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever. But it was something adjacent to it, a loosening of the tight knot of anger I'd been carrying. Colin found me still sitting there 20 minutes later when he came downstairs for his own coffee. He took one look at my face and asked what was wrong. I showed him the email, watched him read it with the same skepticism I'd felt. When he finished, he looked at me carefully and asked what I was thinking. I told him I didn't know, which was the truth. Part of me wanted to delete the email and pretend it had never arrived, to protect the peace I'd worked so hard to build. Part of me was curious about this version of Victoria who seemed, at least on the page, to have developed some self-awareness. And part of me, the part one was least proud of, wanted her to hurt the way she'd hurt me, wanted her rock bottom to be even lower, wanted cosmic justice to keep punishing her for years of cruelty. Colin listened to all of this, then said something that stuck with me. He said that forgiveness wasn't about Victoria, it was about me, about whether continuing to carry anger served me or just weighed me down. He said I didn't owe her anything, not a response, not absolution, not a relationship, but that I might owe myself the freedom that comes from letting go of resentment. I didn't respond to the email that day or the next day or the day after that. I let it sit in my inbox like a stone, something I was aware of but not ready to touch. In the meantime, life continued. I taught my fourth graders about fractions and the water cycle. Colin and I hosted a dinner party for friends, and I laughed more than I had in weeks. Uncle James came over to help me install new shelves in my garage, and we talked about everything except Victoria. But the email was always there in the back of my mind, a question I hadn't answered. 2 weeks later, I was going through old photos, the ones Uncle James and I had salvaged from my parents' house before it sold. There was one of Victoria and me as children, maybe 8 and 12, standing in front of a Christmas tree. Victoria had her arm around me, and we were both grinning at the camera, genuine smiles that hadn't yet learned to perform. I stared at that photo for a long time, trying to remember what it felt like to be that little girl who still believed her big sister would protect her, who hadn't yet learned that love in our family was conditional and unevenly distributed. That night I sat down and wrote a response. It was shorter than Victoria's email, just a few paragraphs. I told her I'd received her message and appreciated the apology, that I believed she was sincere even though trust would take more than words to rebuild. I told her I was glad she was in therapy, that I hoped she continued to grow and find peace. But I also told her the truth, that I wasn't ready for a relationship with her, that too much had happened for me to simply welcome her back into my life. I said that maybe someday that would change or maybe it wouldn't, but for now I needed the boundaries I'd established. I ended by saying I hoped she found happiness, that I genuinely meant that, and that I was grateful she'd taken the time to acknowledge what had happened between us. I read it over several times before sending it, making sure I wasn't being cruel, but also wasn't making promises I couldn't keep. Then I hit send and felt something shift inside me, a small release of pressure I hadn't realized I was carrying. Victoria responded the next day with a brief message thanking me for replying at all, saying she understood and respected my boundaries, and that she wouldn't reach out again unless I indicated I was open to it. And then, true to her word, she didn't. The months passed and I found myself thinking about her less and less. The anger that had been such a constant companion began to fade, not disappearing entirely but becoming something I could set down when I chose to. I threw myself into my work, started a tutoring program for struggling students, and discovered I was good at reaching kids that other teachers had written off. Colin and I talked about starting a family, a conversation that felt both terrifying and exciting. Uncle James turned 65 and threw a massive party where half the fire department showed up, and I gave a toast about how he'd been more of a parent to me than my actual parents ever managed to be. Life was full and good and mostly free of the shadows that had haunted me for so long. Then, about 8 months after that first email, I ran into someone who knew Victoria. It was at a fundraiser for the school district, one of those events where teachers mingle with donors and try to convince wealthy people to care about public education. A woman approached me during the cocktail hour, introducing herself as Linda, and mentioned that she worked at a nonprofit that provided job training for people re-entering the workforce. We chatted about her work and then she mentioned, almost casually, that she'd recently placed someone I might know in a position at a local library. Victoria Foster, she said, watching my face carefully. I must have reacted because Linda quickly added that she hoped she hadn't overstepped, that Victoria had mentioned having a complicated relationship with her sister and Linda hadn't connected that I was the sister until just now. I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral, how Victoria was doing. Linda's expression softened. She said Victoria had been one of their program's success stories, that she'd come to them humble and willing to do the work, that she'd taken every training seriously and never acted entitled to anything. Linda said Victoria was working as a library assistant, shelving books and helping patrons, and seemed genuinely content with it. She said Victoria had mentioned in their check-ins that she was learning to find satisfaction in being useful rather than impressive, in contributing rather than taking. I listened to this description of my sister and barely recognized the person Linda was describing. The Victoria I'd known wouldn't have lasted a day in a job that didn't come with status or attention. But people change, I reminded myself. Or at least some people do, if the circumstances force them to and they're willing to do the internal work. I thanked Linda for sharing, said I was glad Victoria had found support, and tried to move the conversation back to education funding. But for the rest of the evening, I kept thinking about my sister shelving books in a library, finding meaning in small acts of service, becoming someone I might not recognize if I passed her on the street. Colin noticed my distraction on the drive home and asked what was on my mind. I told him about the conversation with Linda, about this image of Victoria that didn't match any version I'd known. He was quiet for a moment, then asked if I wanted to see her, to verify this change for myself. I said I didn't know, which was becoming my standard answer to anything Victoria related. Part of me was curious, wanted to witness this transformation, wanted proof that the apology email hadn't been just another performance. But part of me was afraid that seeing her would undo the peace I'd found, would drag me back into old patterns and old pain. Colin reached over and squeezed my hand, said whatever I decided was okay, that there was no right answer here. That night I lay awake thinking about forgiveness, about what we owe to people who hurt us, about whether redemption is real, or just a story we tell ourselves. I thought about my parents, about how they'd hurt me through favoritism and neglect, and how I'd still loved them, still cared for them when they were dying. I thought about Uncle James, about how he'd shown me what unconditional support looked like. And I thought about myself, about the person I'd become in the absence of Victoria's toxicity, about whether I could maintain that person if she came back into my life in any capacity. 3 months later I made a decision. I sent Victoria an email, brief and careful, saying I was open to meeting for coffee if she was interested. Nothing more than that, just a conversation. Two adults trying to navigate the wreckage of a shared past. She responded within hours, grateful and cautious, suggesting a coffee shop equidistant from both our neighborhoods. We set a date for the following Saturday, and I spent the week feeling like I was preparing for battle even though I knew that mindset was counterproductive. Colin offered to come with me, to sit at a nearby table just in case, but I told him this was something I needed to do alone. Uncle James had a different reaction when I told him. He was quiet for a long moment, then asked if I was sure I was ready. I told him I wasn't sure of anything, but that I needed to try, needed to see for myself if Victoria had really changed or if this was just another chapter in a long history of manipulation. The coffee shop was one of those generic places, all recycled wood and industrial lighting, the kind that could be in any city in America. I arrived early, found a table near the back, and ordered a latte I was too nervous to drink. Victoria arrived exactly on time and I barely recognized her. She'd cut her hair short, was wearing jeans and a simple sweater instead of the designer clothes she used to favor, and there was something different about her face, less makeup maybe, or just less performance. She looked tired but also somehow lighter, like she'd put down a heavy bag she'd been carrying. We said hello awkwardly, and she ordered a plain coffee before sitting down across from me. For a moment neither of us spoke, and I could feel the weight of everything unsaid between us. Finally, Victoria broke the silence. She thanked me for agreeing to meet, said she knew it was more than she deserved. I told her I'd gotten her email, that I appreciated the apology, but that I needed to understand what had changed, why now, why this sudden self-awareness after years of entitled behavior. She nodded like she'd expected the question. She talked about hitting bottom, about losing Derek and the house and her carefully curated image all at once. She said it had felt like the end of the world, but that it had also been the beginning of something else, a kind of clarity that only comes when you have nothing left to hide behind. She talked about therapy, about how her therapist had helped her see patterns she'd been blind to, ways she'd manipulated people and situations without even recognizing it as manipulation because it was just how she operated. She said she'd spent months being angry at everyone else, at me for stealing the inheritance, at our parents for favoring her and then trying to correct it, at Derek for leaving, at the universe for being unfair. And then one day in a therapy session she'd broken down and admitted that maybe, possibly, she was the common denominator in all these failed relationships. Maybe the problem was her. I listened, watching her face for signs of performance, but what I saw looked like genuine remorse. She told me about the job training program, about learning to show up on time and follow through on commitments, basic things that should have come naturally but somehow hadn't. She talked about working at the library, about how humbling it was to have a job where nobody cared about her Instagram following or her designer bags, where she was evaluated purely on whether she did the work well. She said it had been the first time in her life she'd felt like she was contributing something rather than just taking up space. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't ask if we could be sisters again. She just said she wanted me to know that she understood now, understood what she'd done, understood why I'd cut her out of my life. She said she was working on becoming someone worthy of a second chance, even if that chance never came. We talked for almost 2 hours, and it was the most honest conversation Victoria and I had ever had. I told her about my life, about Colin and the house and my work with struggling students. I told her about Uncle James, about how he'd been my anchor through everything. I even told her about the wedding she hadn't been invited to, and she said she understood why, said she probably wouldn't have invited herself either if the situation were reversed. There were moments of tension, moments where old resentments bubbled up, and I had to consciously push them back down. But there were also moments of something that felt almost like connection. Like we were two people with a complicated shared history trying to find a way forward that didn't require pretending the past hadn't happened. When we finally stood to leave, Victoria asked if I'd be willing to do this again sometime. Maybe not soon but eventually. I told her honestly that I didn't know. That this had been harder than I expected and I needed time to process. She nodded, said she understood. And we parted ways with an awkward half-hug that didn't quite work but also didn't feel forced. I drove home feeling wrung out and confused. Colin was waiting, and I collapsed onto the couch next to him and tried to explain what the meeting had been like. He listened patiently, then asked the question I'd been asking myself. Did I believe she'd really changed? I said I thought so, maybe that she'd seemed different in ways that were hard to fake. But I also said I wasn't ready to trust her. That trust would take time and consistency, not just one good coffee shop performance. Colin said that seemed wise, that I could take this as slowly as I needed, that there was no timeline for forgiveness. That night I called Uncle James and told him about the meeting. He was characteristically careful in his response, saying he was glad I'd done what felt right for me but reminding me to protect myself. He said leopards sometimes change their spots, but usually they just learn to hide them better. I told him I'd be careful, that I wasn't planning on letting Victoria back into my life in any meaningful way, just leaving the door open a crack. Over the next year, Victoria and I met for coffee 3 more times. Each meeting was easier than the last, less weighted with unspoken history. She told me about her life, about the small apartment she'd rented in a part of town she used to consider beneath her, about the community she was building with coworkers and neighbors who didn't know anything about her past. She talked about dating again cautiously, and about how different it was to approach relationships without trying to perform or impress. I shared selectively, not ready to give her full access to my life but willing to offer glimpses. I told her about the tutoring program I'd started, about my plans to maybe pursue a graduate degree in education policy. I showed her pictures of the house, of Colin, of Uncle James at his birthday party. She looked at the photos with something like wistfulness, and I realized she was seeing the life she could have had if she'd made different choices, been a different person. During our 4th coffee meeting, she brought something with her. A small box wrapped in plain brown paper. She said she'd found it while going through storage, things salvaged from the Lake Oswego house before it sold. Inside was a photo album, one I didn't recognize. It was full of pictures of us as kids, images I'd never seen, taken by our parents during moments when Victoria and I had actually gotten along. There we were building a sandcastle on a beach trip, both of us covered in sand and grinning. There we were dressed up for Halloween, Victoria as a princess and me as a witch, our hands linked as we walked down the sidewalk. There we were on Christmas morning, sitting in matching pajamas surrounded by torn wrapping paper. I looked through the album feeling something crack open in my chest. Grief for the relationship we could have had, for the sisters we might have been if circumstances and personalities had aligned differently. Victoria watched me look through the photos and said quietly that she'd kept the album, because looking at it reminded her that we hadn't always been enemies, that there had been a time when she'd actually cared about being my big sister. She said she didn't expect these old photos to fix anything, but she wanted me to have them, to remember that the good moments had existed even if they'd been outnumbered by the bad ones. I took the album home and showed it to Colin, And we looked through it together, him seeing a version of my childhood I'd never shared because I'd mostly forgotten it existed. He said it must be confusing, having evidence that things hadn't always been terrible, and I agreed. It would have been easier if Victoria had been purely villainous, if there had been no moments of genuine sisterhood to complicate the narrative. But life is rarely that simple, and people are rarely that one-dimensional. Another year passed and Victoria and I settled into a rhythm of occasional contact, coffee every few months, brief text exchanges on birthdays and holidays. It wasn't a close relationship, but it was something. An acknowledgement that we shared history and biology, even if we'd never be the sisters either of us might have wanted. I learned through our conversations that she'd been promoted at the library, that she was taking community college classes in library science, that she'd found something approaching purpose in a life that looked nothing like the one she'd imagined for herself. She'd started volunteering at a women's shelter, helping other people navigate the kind of rock bottom she'd experienced. She told me once hesitantly that going through the court case and losing everything had been the worst thing that ever happened to her, but also maybe the best thing because it had forced her to become a person she could actually respect. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded. Colin and I eventually had a baby, a daughter we named Grace. When I sent Victoria a photo, she responded with congratulations that seemed genuine, asking if there was anything she could send, any way she could help. I told her no, but thank you that we had everything we needed. I didn't tell her that Uncle James had already set up a college fund, that he'd become Grandpa James and was more excited about this baby than I'd ever seen him. When Grace was 6 months old, Victoria asked if she could meet her. The question hung in the air between us during one of our coffee meetings, tentative and loaded. I told her I needed to think about it, to talk to Colin to figure out what boundaries that would require. Colin's response was measured. He said it was entirely my decision, that he'd support whatever I chose, but that Grace's safety and well-being had to come first. If I had any doubt about Victoria's stability or intentions, we should wait. I appreciated his protectiveness even as I recognized my own conflicted feelings. Victoria had been terrible to me, had tried to destroy me, but she was also my sister, Grace's biological aunt. Did Grace deserve to know her, to have the option of that relationship? Or was I obligated to protect my daughter from someone who'd caused me so much pain? I talked to Uncle James about it, and his response surprised me. He said that people could change, that he'd seen it happen, though rarely and usually only after significant consequences. He said if I believed Victoria was genuinely different, if I wanted to take the risk, he wouldn't judge me for it. But he also said that forgiveness didn't require putting myself or my daughter in a vulnerable position, that I could forgive Victoria for my own peace while still maintaining protective boundaries. In the end, I decided to let Victoria meet Grace, but on my terms in my home with Colin present. Victoria arrived with a simple baby gift, nothing extravagant, and I could see her hands shaking slightly as she held my daughter for the first time. She looked at Grace with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between tenderness and regret, and she whispered that Grace was beautiful. She held her for maybe 5 minutes before handing her back, saying she didn't want to overstay her welcome. As she left, she thanked me for trusting her enough to allow the visit, said it meant more than I probably realized. After she was gone, Colin asked how I felt. I told him I felt okay, that it had been less terrible than I'd feared, that maybe this was what healing looked like, incremental and incomplete but still moving forward. Victoria never pushed for more access to Grace, never asked to babysit or suggested family gatherings. She seemed to understand that her role would be limited, maybe forever, and she accepted that with a grace I wouldn't have expected from the person she used to be. 5 years after the courthouse, 7 years after our parents died, I can say that Victoria and I have something resembling a relationship, though it doesn't look like sisterhood in any traditional sense. We're cordial, sometimes friendly, occasionally even warm. But there's always a distance between us. A protective buffer I'm not sure will ever fully dissolve. And that's okay. I've learned that forgiveness doesn't require reconciliation, that you can release anger without inviting someone back into your inner circle. I've learned that people can change, but that change doesn't erase history, doesn't undo harm, doesn't automatically restore trust. I've learned that family is complicated, and that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is accept those complications without trying to resolve them into something neat and simple. My life now is so different from what I imagined during those dark months of legal battles and social media attacks. I have a career I love, a partner who supports me, a daughter who fills my days with joy and chaos, and Uncle James, who remains my touchstone and my reminder that family is defined by actions, not biology. Victoria exists on the periphery of this life, close enough that I'm aware of her, far enough that she can't hurt me the way she once did. And maybe that's the best possible outcome, given where we started. Maybe this careful distance, this measured forgiveness, is its own kind of victory. I kept the inheritance, not just the money and property but the acknowledgement it represented, the validation that I mattered, that my years of showing up and taking care and being overlooked hadn't been for nothing. I used that inheritance to build a life that reflects my values, to help students who remind me of my younger self, to create stability for my family. And in doing that, I've found something more valuable than any amount of money. Peace. The kind of peace that comes from knowing you fought for what was right, stood up to someone who tried to destroy you, and came out the other side stronger and more certain of who you are. Victoria tried to take everything from me, my inheritance, my reputation, my sense of self-worth. But she failed because I'd spent my whole life building an identity separate from her, separate from our parents' favoritism, separate from the family dynamics that had tried to make me small. I look at Grace sometimes, playing in the living room of the house my parents' inheritance helped me buy, and I think about the lessons I want to teach her. I want her to know that fairness matters, that speaking up for yourself isn't selfish, that walking away from toxicity is strength, not weakness. I want her to understand that family should lift you up, not tear you down, and that it's okay to create boundaries even with people you love. I want her to see Uncle James and understand that the best family members are the ones who show up consistently, who love you without conditions, who fight for you when you're too tired to fight for yourself. And maybe someday when she's old enough to understand complexity, I'll tell her about Victoria, about the aunt who exists at the edges of her life. I'll tell her the full story, the painful parts and the hopeful parts, the betrayal and the eventual cautious peace. I'll tell her that people are capable of both tremendous harm and genuine growth, that forgiveness is possible but trust must be earned, that you can hold space for someone's transformation while still protecting yourself from who they used to be. For now, though, I'm just living. Teaching my students, raising my daughter, loving my husband, spending Sundays in Uncle James's workshop learning to build things with my hands. I'm hiking in the Columbia River Gorge, and having game nights with friends and reading bedtime stories in silly voices. I'm doing all the ordinary, beautiful things that make up a life I almost let Victoria destroy. Sometimes I still think about those months of legal warfare, about standing in that courtroom and fighting for my right to be treated fairly. Sometimes I feel the old anger flicker, usually when I hear about some new injustice, some story of favoritism or manipulation that mirrors my own experience. But mostly I feel grateful. Grateful that my parents, despite their failures, tried to make things right at the end. Grateful for Uncle James, for his unwavering support when I needed it most. Grateful for the strength I didn't know I had until I was forced to use it. And yes, even grateful for Victoria in a strange way because fighting her taught me what I was capable of, showed me I could stand up to the person who'd intimidated me my whole life and win. The inheritance was never really about money. It was about being seen, being valued, being told that my life and my choices and my quiet perseverance mattered as much as Victoria's loud demands and dramatic crises. It was about justice, about the universe or my parents or fate or whatever you want to call it finally acknowledging that I deserved equity, deserved consideration, deserved to be treated as an equal member of my own family. I fought for that, won it, and used it to build something lasting. And now, years later, with perspective and distance and a life full of people who actually love me well, I can look back on the whole painful mess and see it for what it was. The end of one story and the beginning of another. The story where I stopped waiting for my family to see my worth and started seeing it myself. The story where I learned that fighting back doesn't make you bitter. It makes you strong. The story where the underestimated daughter, the one who was never supposed to amount to much, built a life that mattered. That's the story I'm living now. And it's better than any inheritance could ever be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.